What we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking our ogre character that we used in rigging DVD number 1, and part of the rig that we used, just the legs that we set up, that had a foot roll controls added to it. I've deleted the spinal column that we used because I'm going to be rebuilding that spinal column using Spline IK. I've added layers to this file as well to break it down. The mesh is on a separate layer. I want to pick object properties, make it see-through, and leave it as frozen so that we can't select it. This way we can see what we're building with, but don't have to actually be in wireframe to do it. Now the spline of the character is going to run all the way up through the back, up to the base of the neck. I tend not to carry them up into the head, because if you do that, when you adjust the head, you start adjusting the shoulders. I like to isolate it a bit more. You'll see what I mean later in the section. To start with, I want to start with creating a spline. And I want to set them to smooth to start with. And I want to create 5 control vertices on this spline. Those control vertices are set at points where I want to get control over the spline. You can make this more complicated. You can add more of them if you like. I do in further rigs, but for this rig I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible so we can follow it. We're going to have a control that'll control the bottom of the spline, the waist area, and the top of the neck, or the top of the shoulder, sorry. Allow me to show you what happens if we use Spline IK at max. And I'm going to create a set of bones. Make them much smaller to start with, maybe the size of 2. To apply Spline IK, the built-in version, you pick the root bone of the chain, go to Animation, IK Solvers, Spline IK Solver, pick the top of the chain, and then pick the spline, and it'll jump the bone chain to it. If you notice, it also hasn't resized the bone chain to fit the spline. It adds, on the spline itself, it adds a Spline IK modifier, and adds control helper objects to the spline. What this allows for you to be able to do is grab the controls and be able to pull the vertices of the spline around. I'm going to turn it on to no linking for the Spline IK control. This is fine and all, but what you'll notice with the Spline IK, if you ever go to use it, is there's flipping that can happen. And that usually happens when points of the spline pass 90 degrees of others. It becomes uncontrollable, and you can't actually stop the bones from flipping over. And you can see that happening here with the second from top bone as it flips over when I pass 90 degrees. This is impossible to control or stop in max because of the way the Spline IK is set up. Another problem with it is, going to the motion panel with the solver selected, is there's a start twist angle, which twists the entire bone chain, and an end twist angle. Now using this you can actually get it so you get a twist at one end and a twist at the other. But that's it, unfortunately. You can't control the twist of this bone in the middle individually, or any given bone in the middle of the chain. You can't twist it from the center out in both directions. So you're kind of limited as to what you're going to get as far as a setup for your bones. I'm going to delete the IK solver. I'm going to delete the Spline IK control and the helper objects that it created and start from scratch. Actually, I'll delete the bone chain as well. So with our spline in place at the base of the neck, somewhere around the upper shoulders, middle of the body, and down at the base of the body. I'm going to actually start by using the Spline IK modifier. Like I said, I don't use the Spline IK solver, but I do use the Spline IK modifier because this is a very handy modifier. It automatically will build you control objects at every vertex in the spline and sets them up very nicely, just like if you had a linked X form in the stack, several linked X forms, and spline selects. So it makes it much easier and simpler in the stack. You can just press create helpers and it'll create all the helper objects. You can then set a size for all those helper objects to make it really simple. You can also choose how they are going to be displayed. I'll leave that set on box. I also set it to no linking because linking sets it up so that the base will control all of them. We don't want this to happen. We want each one to be independent. For the bones, I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm going to keep 5 bones only for our spline, just to make it simple on the setup. This way we have less setup to do for this tutorial, but you can use as many bones as you like. Create system bones. I'm going to keep them down to a size of 2. And I want to create a set of bones. These don't even need to be sized perfectly correctly at this point because we'll be aligning them to the spline and aligning them to controls along the spline as we go. I'm just going to leave this off to one side for now, and you'll see how we connect that into the spline later on. The next thing I want to create is some control objects. I'm going to use those nice little control objects that I use for my rigs, built from splines, and I'm just using that scripted tool that I have for building those. Again, you can build those using circles and attaching them all together. I have seen people build these out of 3 circles and use the group control to actually group all 3 of them together. I would strongly suggest against this, as grouping can cause other problems. These controls are going to control this spinal column. Some of them are going to be directly controlled, basically on a one-to-one basis. Others are going to be controlled with a bit of a fall off between 2. So we're going to be using some constraints for this. First thing I like to do is get my axis aligned to the correct spot on the spline so that it isn't floating out in space, the pivot point. I'm going to go to the hierarchy panel, pivot, effect pivot only, use my align tool, and align position X, Y, Z, pivot to pivot. I happen to have added it to a quad menu, and I want to align them up to the control object they're directly going to be affecting. So you can see that the pivot's in the same spot for both objects now. Now I'm going to do a bit of linking. I'm going to link top control here for the spline to the control object we'll be animating with. I'll be linking the one at the hips directly to the hip control, and the tailbone straight to the tailbone helper, or control object. Now you can see I can pick the controls, and I have some effect on the spline. I'm now still missing out on 2 controls. These controls are going to be controlled by biasing the weight between these 2. as well as they're also going to be controlled by rotating these objects, so that when I rotate it, it actually moves this control back and forth around in an arc. Position constraints and orientation constraints won't get us what we want, because it'll rotate right on its spot, and that's not going to do us any good. When rotating it, the position doesn't change, so position constraint isn't going to help us if we directly constrain to this control object. The way to get around this is to create some more point helpers. I'm going to create a point helper. I'm going to change what it looks like to a cross here. And I'm just going to make sure that its orientation is aligned to world space. I built it in a left viewport, so it won't be. I'm going to create a second one. I'm going to link each point helper down to a control. So now when I rotate a control, I get a positional change on the point helper. Next thing I want to do is I want to create a couple more point helpers. Actually, I'll just make a copy of this one. Now unlink it. And I'll change the display again. This time I'll use a center marker and a box to display this one. Maybe make it a bit smaller. It sounds very confusing, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these helpers to constrain to these helpers. These ones will then be directly linked to these. Again, there's a reason for this. If I directly constrain this off to something out here, say through a position constraint, it jumps and moves to it. I can use keep initial offset, but you'll find that there's issues and problems with that later on. So if I build all my control set out here, do all my constraining out here, and then just directly do some links, I can get a little bit better control over the whole thing. It's also easier to go back and tweak and fix, because I can just simply unlink the spline from the set of controls. Go about adjusting my weights and everything in my constraints, and then relink it back up again without having to mess around with constraint systems. I'm going to need two of these. One's going to be for this one down here. One's going to be for the one at the top. Let's do this one at the top here. This control should move more with this one than it does with this one. This point here should move more with this one than it does with this one. So, starting with this object here, I'm going to constrain it. Position constrain it to the top, and I'm going to position constrain it to the bottom. Right now it's set on a 50-50 basis between the two, so it moves halfway between. What I'm going to do is I want to bias it more to the top one and try some values and see what happens. In this case, I'll try 75 to the top and only 25 to the bottom. Let's do the exact opposite on this one. I'm going to go back and I'm going to use my quad menus for the position constraints. The first one is there. Second one's there. Second one's going to be the top one. Then it's going to be 25% on this one and 75% of the bottom. So now I have the exact opposite on this control. I can now just directly link these in to the constrained objects. This will now get me a spline that moves nice and smooth. It'll also get me one that I can rotate and bend and flex the spline with. All this I've had to do because the NURBS curves in Max are very, very slow. And if I use Spline IK or any kind of constraint systems along one, it seems to go very slow. It would be nice because NURBS curves already have some of this sort of thing built into it where you get a nice fall off. Splines, however, have the problem is that they can bend and overbend and come back if you only move one control. So this is a real nice way of controlling it. The next chapter will be setting up all of the control objects to handle the bone system itself.